So we're going to begin this morning by taking a look back at the most difficult items that popped up on test number 2 for you guys. Test number 2 results were posted on Tuesday. Class average was a 74, which is a C. I usually look at the difference between the percentages of A's and B's versus D's and F's. So we had 39% A's and B's versus 33% D's and F's. So when that's a positive number, that is the number of A's and B's are greater than the number of D's and F's, that's usually a pretty good sign. So things were better than they were on the first test. I want to review about 6 items that were the ones that caused the most problems. These are typically ones where half of the class or more got it wrong, and so we'll take a look at those specific items together right now. This first one, and I want you guys to chime into the chat box with the correct answer for me as we go here. Miriam steps out of a store and glances at her car parked across the street. A bus passes by, momentarily blocking her view of the car. Miriam sees the bus as closer than her car due to which of those depth cues? When something blocks something else out, which one is that? A, B, C, or D? Yep, that's D. It's interposition. About 60% of you guys got that one right. This one was a matching question hidden in the context of a multiple choice item here. Which of these is correctly matching a form of operant conditioning with a good example of it? So we have a positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment scenario presented there. Which one of those is correctly matched up? A, B, C, or D? Megan thinks it's B. Anybody else want to join with her? I guess 2 Megans think it's B. Well, then that must mean it's right, especially on St. Patrick's Day, for God's sake, right? Negative reinforcement, where Jeff puts up his umbrella when it starts to sprinkle. What does he avoid? He avoids getting wet. Okay, so the correct answer there was B. About 60% of you got that one right. Number 17 here. Advertisers use enjoyable music, cute babies, attractive models, and funny spokespeople to create positive advertisements. All of those things are what? This was the single most difficult item on the test, although it really should not have been. Are they CS's, neutral stimuli, positive reinforcers, or US's? For number 17 here. Nobody wants to step forward and say what they are. Kristen thinks they're CS's. Kristen's one of our SI leaders. That's a good guess, but it's not the right guess. That's okay. SI leaders aren't required to know every single item. That's all right. So if it's not CS, what do you think now? How about a US? What do those things automatically cause people to do? They cause them to have positive emotions, right? Enjoyable music, cute babies, attractive people, funny people. They make us have a positive reaction that we're then going to use to hook this stimulus to some product, right? I want to connect your positive reaction to attractive models with Budweiser beer so that you have a positive reaction to Budweiser beer, right? That's the way that one worked. Again, less than a quarter of you got that one correct. Okay? Yeah, question about this one. No, it's not CS's because CS's are previously neutral stimuli. These are things that in and of themselves cause a reaction. They're like the puff of air to your eyeball, which makes you blink. These things in and of themselves, if you present someone with a cute baby, they're going to have a positive emotional reaction. Right? So they're all US's, not CS's. Does that make sense? We're going to connect these things with whatever our product might be. Good question. You're welcome. All right. A couple more here. This one Only half of you got it right. This should have been much, much higher, right? Taxis down on the street look tiny when you're up on the 90th floor. What is that size? What? That's size constancy. That should have been an easy one. I'm amazed that that caused as many problems as it did. Olfaction, how does smell differ from everything else? I said this multiple times during the recording that I shared with you guys on sensation. What's the difference here? I kept saying everything other than smell gets routed through the thalamus. So smell, or the olfactory system, is the only one that doesn't go through the thalamus. And then finally, which one of these shows the correct sequence here? So as light passes through the structures of the eye, what's the correct sequence? The correct sequence is B. Cornea is the outer layer, covering the eyeball, the pupil, the lens, and then the retina on the back side of the eye. Okay? So that was the story there. Again, all of those were items where 30 to 60% of you got them right, which would mean that 40 to 70% of you got them wrong. All right? Any other questions about test 2 before we shut the book there and move on? So again, we jumped up to a class average of 74 from a class average of 70. So we went from a C- to a C. I'll share the data regarding supplemental instruction participation when we get together on Tuesday. So let's talk about the lay of the land here in the third quarter of our course. It's part 3 of 4. So I usually refer to it as the third quarter of the course. And what happens in the third quarter of the course is that we go through a sprint. The third quarter of the course in many ways is a sprint, because what happens is we are going to try to cover a total of 4 chapters in 5 days of lectures. Okay, so we have class today. We have class on Tuesday face-to-face. There will be an online section next Thursday. That's 3 class sessions before spring break. We have spring break, and we come back. We have a face-to-face class, and then another online session. So 5 class meetings, and then we do test number 3 on Tuesday, the 12th of April. So that will get here quickly. So we have 5 lectures to cover 4 chapters, and we have spring break in the middle. This is where things can get off the rails if you don't stay on top of things. So if you're somebody who is probably not going to do much of anything regarding your academic work over spring break, it would be a really good idea to get on top of this stuff and get things done before spring break rolls around. So we're going to begin this morning with the chapter on intelligence. So in your textbook, this is chapter 7, and it's a chunk of chapter 7. It's really only pages 312 to 326, so it's only 15 pages worth of textbook reading. And because we will be finishing this chapter this morning, one day, one chapter, we may have a little bit left to finish on Tuesday morning. You'll have the learning curve quizzes for chapter 10 on intelligence through Sunday night at 11, so make sure you get those done. Here's how we're going to approach this section on intelligence and intelligence assessment. We're going to talk about assessment in general. Then we're going to talk about IQ testing, or intelligence quotient testing in specific terms. And then we're going to spend probably the last 20 to 25 minutes talking about the nature versus nurture issue with respect to intelligence. Okay, so this is kind of the organization as we work our way through this segment on intelligence and intelligence assessment. I made these green slides especially for today. This is usually a set of slides that's a different color, but I figured since it was St. Patrick's Day, we should go with the green. My 100% Irish mom will be very, very proud of me for having done that. So let's begin by talking about assessment and what we mean by psychological assessment. Psychological assessment differs from things that you do on an everyday basis, judgments that you make on an everyday basis, in a couple of ways. Mainly, it differs because it involves, as it says on the slide right here, the use of specified procedures. That's probably the key phrase here as we're thinking about psychological assessment. We use specific procedures to evaluate people. We might be evaluating their abilities. So when we talk about intelligence assessment, Intelligence would be one example of an ability that we might want to assess. We might be looking at people's behaviors. Maybe we're doing a psychological assessment of a child who is thought to possibly have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, okay? And we're using psychological assessment checklists, for example, to be completed by moms and dads and teachers to assess specific behaviors that might map on to that psychological disorder. We might be looking at people's personal qualities. So in the final segment of this third quarter of the course, we'll be talking about personality, right? Are you outgoing and talkative in the life of the party? Or are you instead a little bit quiet and shy and reserved? Okay, the key phrase again is that we are going to use specified procedures. One of the things I hope to get across to you today is sort of the almost rigidity with which you have to perform these procedures so that when you get done doing a psychological assessment, you can make sense of the results that you come up with. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we get into some of the specific intelligence tests that we'll be discussing today, we'll talk about you have to do this in a certain way, and you have to begin at a certain point and use the same questions and give everyone the same amount of time and all of that sort of stuff, because it turns out that on the back end, when you want to score somebody's intelligence, for example, based on an IQ test or an intelligence test, the only way you can score it in a way that's meaningful is to be able to compare their performance to the performance of thousands of other people who were part of the standardization sample that was used to help create that test. Okay? And it's only by following those specified procedures that you're able to make sense on the back end of something about the person's intelligence or maybe about their personality or whatever the case might be. So when we talk about psychological assessment, there are three important considerations that we have to always keep in mind, and I guarantee you I'm going to ask you 2 test questions from these 3 important considerations. So already you know 2 of the next 40 test questions for test number 3. 2 of the 3 we've already talked about, so that should make it a little bit easier here. When we talk about psychological assessment, whether it's an intelligence assessment or personality assessment or some sort of behavioral assessment, all of those assessments have to have good reliability, they have to have good validity, and they have to follow standardized administration procedures. These are the specified procedures that I was referring to on that previous slide. So let's talk about intelligence assessment today. Okay? In terms of reliability, we learned back in the section on research methods, right, back in the first couple weeks of class, that reliability, in a word, is about the consistency of a measure. Okay, so if our new Lamecus IQ test that we developed today, so that I can retire when I become super wealthy because everybody starts using it, we're going to develop that today, spend the time and effort. One of the things we're going to have to demonstrate for that test is that it's good, that it has good test-retest reliability. Now you may remember from our discussion previously, one of the ways we demonstrate test-retest reliability is we correlate scores at time 1 with someone's scores at time 2. And what we construct basically is a scatter plot. You guys might remember this, right? And generally what we hope to have happen is that folks who scored low at time 1 tend to score low at time 2, and folks who scored high at time 1 tend to score high at time 2. Okay? Does that look familiar? Something like that. And we would drop a line through that scatter plot and say, let's say, for example, that we determine that our test-retest reliability here for the new Lamecus IQ test is positive 0.91. Awesome. That means that if you took that test today on March 17th and came back 3 weeks from now on April 7th, what would happen is your scores would be pretty similar. You got a 108 today, you get around a 108 again in 3 weeks' time. Okay, so it doesn't need to be exactly the same score, but generally speaking, again, folks who score low at time 1 would tend to score low at time 2, down in here. Folks who score high at time 1 would tend to score high at time 2. Okay, so it's got reliability. But if you remember from the section on research methods, reliability is not enough, right? That was when we talked about the bathroom scale that said I was 100 pounds, and you guys kind of chuckled. And so the idea with reliability is the scores are consistent over time, right? So intelligence is a variable that we would expect to be pretty consistent over time. You don't suddenly get amazingly smarter or amazingly less intelligent over the course of 3 or 4 weeks. So if we are developing a measurement of your intelligence, the scores at 2 points in time should be associated with each other. They should be consistent. Okay, so that's the first piece. Besides reliability, we also need to have a test that has validity. And in this case, we said, in one word, validity was the truthfulness of the test, right? How well does my measure what I say it measures? You guys remember talking about that in the section on research methods? So if it's a valid IQ test, today what we're going to focus on is the fact that it probably covers a whole host of different kinds of intellectual capacities, right? So if it's going to measure what I say it measures, it's going to test a range of abilities, right? It's not just going to be a bunch of vocabulary items or a bunch of math problems. Okay, a valid measure of intelligence probably would measure vocabulary skills and arithmetic skills. But it probably also would get into things like, well, memory. It might get into problem solving, analytical reasoning, logical reasoning, different things like that that are indicators of intelligence. Again, looking at a range of abilities. So we would expect, for example, that an IQ test would have what we might call predictive validity. Predictive validity just refers to the ability of a test to be associated with some kind of outcome that we're interested in. And give you another example outside of an IQ test where we hope something has predictive validity. The SAT or the ACT should have predictive validity of what? Tell me in the chat box. They should have predictive validity about what for people who take those tests? If you score high on the SAT, what should happen going forward in time as you move into college? This is a valid measure that has good predictive validity. People who score high on SATs should do what in college versus people who score low on SATs? How might they differ in their academic performance in college? Right? High scorers should do better, right? Low scorers should do worse. That's the whole point of the SAT, isn't it? Well, I think it's really twofold. It's one, to be predictive of who's going to succeed in college, and I think it's also used to try to be able to compare and contrast apples to oranges in terms of different high school backgrounds you might have, right? So validity, again, is truthfulness. We'll talk about that a lot today when we're discussing the various subtests that are part of the intelligence tests that are widely used today. And then finally, standardization is the one I really want to emphasize, because not only is it new, but it goes back to what we were talking about on this slide in terms of the specified procedures that you have to use when you're doing psychological assessment. We have to use uniform testing procedures. In English, that means you have to treat everyone the same. Okay, so I'll even spell that out here down below. Treat everyone the same. That means everyone gets the same subtests in the same order with the same items, and they're given the same amount of time to complete those items. Why? Because when you do that on the front end, on the back end, you can then compare the performance of those individuals to their same age peers. You're going to see me type in the term same age peers about 3 times today. Same age peers in English means if you are 20 years old, when you take an IQ test, your performance is going to be compared to that of thousands of others who are 20 years old. And if your grandmother, who's 70, takes an IQ test today, we're not going to compare her to 20-year-olds. We're going to compare her to 70-year-olds. And again, the only way that we can do that in a meaningful way is to make sure that the way that we tested you with our uniform testing procedures is identical to the way that the thousands of people who were part of the standardization sample for this test were treated. Okay? So again, this idea of some rigidity with which you administer these tests. You have to sit in a certain place. You have to begin the test with a certain item. You have to do the subtest in a certain order. And if you do all that, then on the back end, when you score it and add up their point totals, you know that what you're getting is something that is able to be compared to these large standardization samples. And that's how we can come up with a score like 108 or 110 or 94 or whatever the case might be, and know that that actually means something in light of comparing those scores to those of your same age peers. Okay? Let me stop there for a second. Any questions about any of these three? Reliability, validity, or standardization? Everybody feel like they've got it? Let's see what you've got by doing a quick polling question. So let me push a couple buttons here and see if you guys are following along with an ABCD question here. How about this one? A teacher grades by giving men C's and women A's. This method is reliable, valid, both, or neither. I'll give you guys 40 seconds to think your way through that one. All right, 5 more seconds. All right. Uh-oh. All right. 3 people had it right, 8 people had it wrong, and 3 people are asleep. All right, let me look on my end. Grant and Kristen both chose A. Everybody else, I actually chimed in and said A, so one of the 3 choosing A was me. Everybody else chose D. So the people who chose D think this is neither reliable nor valid. Kristen and Grant, why did you guys think, well, it is reliable? Because that, in fact, is the correct answer. Can you guys explain that to us for a minute in the chat box? It is consistent. How so, Grant? What do you mean when it's a consistent way of grading here? The men are getting C's and the women are getting A's. I guess if we gave a test today, we gave a test tomorrow, we gave a test next Friday, what's going to happen every single time? I saw Kristen typing something, I thought. Every single time, you're right, the men always get a C and the women always get an A. Now the women are going to like that because they're getting A's, right? But the issue is what? It's not with respect to reliability, because it is going to yield consistent results. The problem is with respect to what? Huge problems here in terms of validity, right? Validity, again, is how well are you measuring what you say you're measuring? Are you measuring, let's say this is a physics test, okay, or a history test. Are you measuring what people know about physics or history if all the guys always get C's and all the women always get A's? No. I mean, if you looked at the grades, what's the one thing you can deduce from the grades that you look at in the grade book? You could conclude what? If you know that all the men get C's and all the women get A's, and you look just at the grades, you can figure out the gender of the person. You can figure out, okay, all these people here who got C's, I know those are all the guys. All these people here got A's, I know that's all the women. Okay. So something going on here for sure. The problem is with respect to validity. It's not a problem with reliability because it is yielding consistent results. Questions about that at all? Everybody see why this is reliable? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the history of intelligence testing here in psychology. Binet is the name you'll need to be familiar with. And he was put in charge around the turn of the century, at the year 1900, of developing a test to distinguish between what today we would call developmentally disabled kids and quote-unquote normal kids. Ultimately, in the early 1900s, he develops the first workable intelligence test, some of the items of which you could see pictured on the left side here. What's really interesting and important, I think, about Binet's original test is that it was very broad-based. right? Remember when we were talking about validity back here, we said one of the things that's important is that if we're going to have a valid measure of intelligence, it should tap a full range of abilities, right? Arithmetic skills and language skills and memory and speed of processing and visual spatial skills and problem solving skills and analytical skills. Well, his test does a real nice job of that. One of the unique concepts that he used early on, which was ultimately abandoned, and we'll talk about why in a couple of minutes here, was the concept of mental age. Okay? To determine an intelligence quotient, that's what IQ stands for, intelligence quotient, Binet used the concept of mental age to help calculate that score. Here's what mental age means. Mental age was a hypothetical construct that Binet used to help think about how were you doing in terms of your intellectual function. And it was sort of to be thought about in this way. Let's imagine you had a series of 30 increasingly difficult math problems. It begins with 2 plus 2 and runs all the way through some really difficult calculus problem. Okay? And maybe from those 30 problems, we know that most 10-year-olds get up to about item number 12. Okay? So if you're 10, we'd expect you to get the first 12 right and then not get any more right after that. Okay? If you are actually 10 years old, and instead of starting to get questions wrong at number 13, after getting the first 12 right, maybe you start getting questions wrong at number 21. You get the first 20 right instead of only the first 12 right. Okay? And we know that on average that it's 16-year-olds who typically get correct all the way up to item number 20. Okay? So most of the time, 10-year-olds get up to item number 12. 16-year-olds typically get correct through item number 20. We would say that your mental age is that of a 16-year-old if you're getting all the way up to item number 20. We know you're only 10, but your mental age in this case would be 16. Okay? You're scoring like 16-year-olds do, not like 10-year-olds do. Does that make sense? This mental age idea? So it's a number that we hang on your performance when we have this nice gradation of increasingly difficult items. And again, it could be math, it could be vocabulary, it could be some other kind of aspect of your function. So we take that mental age score, that's MA, and we divide it by your chronological age. Okay, so the formula here is IQ equals mental age divided by your chronological age. I'm just going to write chrono age, right? Mental age divided by chronological age, and because people really don't like working with decimals, we're going to take the resulting quotient, that's why it's called an IQ score, an intelligence quotient, and we're going to multiply it by 100. That will get rid of the decimal points for us. So if your mental age, as assessed, as I just said, was 16, okay, so let's put that up here. Mental age is 16. And your chronological age, we say you're actually really 10 years old. So your chronological age is how old you really are. If I asked you guys today, how old are you, and you said 18 or 19 or 20, that's your chronological age. So if you're scoring with the mental age of a 16-year-old, yet you're really only 10 years old, what's your resulting IQ score going to be? If it's 16 divided by 10, and then multiply that by 100. We need the math majors to chime in here. What's the IQ score going to be if that's the scenario? Denise has got it, 160, right? Because 16 over 10 is 1.6. 1.6 times 100, you just move the decimal point 2 places to the right, it becomes 160, okay? What if it was the reverse? What if your chronological age instead was 16, you're a 16-year-old, and what we notice in your performance is you're actually performing at the level of a 10-year-old. Okay? You're doing a whole lot worse on these items than we would expect. What would your intelligence quotient score be, your IQ score be in that case? Well, it would be 10 over 16. Take that and multiply it by 100. Denise is killing the math today. That's 5 over 8. That's 62.5. Right, so 5/8 is 0.625. Again, you move the decimal point 2 to the right, you get 62.5. I'm going to give you one of these to solve on test 3, and you're not going to be allowed to use a calculator to do it. Okay, let's think about this for a minute in terms of basic rules of thumb about your IQ score. Okay, in this original way of computing IQ, by the way, we don't compute IQ this way anymore because there's a problem that I alluded to before that I'll spell out in a minute. Okay, if your mental age is greater than your chronological age, what do we know your IQ score is going to be? If MA is greater than CA, the resulting score is always going to be what? Above 100. Denise is still killing it. She's just showing off now, right? What if your mental age is lower or smaller than your chronological age? What do we know your IQ score is going to be? If MA is less than CA, well, that's going to give us a fraction that's less than 1. If you multiply 100 by something that's less than 1, what do you get, Denise? The score that is not above 100, less than 100. What if they're the same? What if MA equals CA? Well, that's going to be 1, and 1 times anything, 1 times 100 is going to give us 100. Okay, here's the problem with mental age. Okay, with mental age, once we get past about age 16 or so, it becomes difficult to develop items that differentiate the performance of, say, a 21-year-old from that of a 24-year-old. Or how does a 28-year-old differ from a 25-year-old on reading? That's what this little comic is about. That's my boy Mark. He's 39, but he's already reading at a 42-year-old level. This comic is about the problem with mental age. What is the problem? The construct starts to break down once we get past age 16. Okay? It becomes increasingly difficult to develop items that help us differentiate between people who are 3 years apart when it's 39 and 42. Can we do that when it's 12 and 9? Yeah, we could do that, and mental age works through that point. But once you get past about age 16, it starts to break apart. So instead of using mental age anymore, what we do is, again, we compare your performance to that of your same age peers. It's the second time I'm typing that on the side, right? So now what we're going to do is we don't even need the mental age construct. What we could do is look at, let's say, your raw score. How many items did you get right on the arithmetic section? How old are you? You're 24, we're going to compare you to a bunch of 24-year-olds. You're 78, we're going to compare you to a bunch of 78-year-olds. And because we've done standardization in our administration of this test, we know that we're doing an apples-to-apples comparison. You have the same items, given in the same order, and you were given the same amount of time to complete them. Okay? Does everybody see how mental age starts to break down once you get past about age 16? Does that make sense? Right? How do you develop some vocabulary items that a 30-year-old will know that a 26-year-old won't know? I don't know. I could develop items that a 9-year-old will know, that a 5-year-old won't know, right? Still a 4-year difference, but once you get to a certain point in terms of age, it becomes really difficult to develop items that differentiate between those two levels of performance. Does that make sense? Any questions about Binet's work here initially with putting together the first workable intelligence test? There's a version of this that continues to be used today. It's called the Stanford Binet. So Louis Terman up at Stanford University sort of built on the work of Binet, and instead of the Terman Binet or the Binet Terman, they call it the Stanford Binet intelligence test. It's one of the more widely used ones, along with the Wechsler test that we're going to talk about in just a couple of minutes here. All right, let's do another polling question. See if you guys get the idea of mental age and chronological age and how to compute an IQ score. So take a look at this one. I'll give you 40 seconds to think your way through it, and I'll be right back. All right, let's take a couple more seconds and finish this one up. Here we go. Oh, that's good to see. 10 out of 11 coming up on 125, right? So it's 10 over 8. That's 1 2/8. That's 1 1/4. That's 1.25. Slide the decimal point over 2, you get 125. Or, as I said before, if you don't even want to do the math, if you could see that mental age is bigger than chronological age, You know it's got to be more than 100. This is the only answer that is more than 100. All right? Questions about that at all? I'm going to give you one of those, I promise. Just because I like you that much, I'm going to give you one of those on test number 3. All right. So let's move away from Binet's original stab at intelligence testing and look at what's done today. Contemporary intelligence tests in the form of the Wechsler IQ test. Again, there's a Stanford Binet, there's some other ones that are used, but the Wechsler ones are really widely used. And I'll also tell you that these are the ones I got trained on in grad school, so they're the ones I actually know a little bit more about. There's one that's used with people your age, for example, 18, 19, 20 years old, right? Most of you guys. It's called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. It's used for folks who are 16 and older. Okay, the WAIS is how it's often referred to. There are parallel versions you can use with younger folks. So the WISC could be used with a 10-year-old. Okay, the WIPSI is the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence. That's for really little ones. We were doing some research in grad school where we did 2 or 3 subtests of the WIPSI with 5- and 6-year-olds who were coming into our lab at USC. Okay, all of the Wechsler tests, whether they're the WIPSI, the WISC, or the WAIS, consist of verbal and performance subscales, and we're going to show you specific items in just a minute. Okay, ultimately, what you get from the WAIS is a verbal IQ score, a performance IQ score, and one summary total score that's referred to as the full scale IQ score. Sometimes you'll see people abbreviate this, the FSIQ, the full scale IQ score. That's the one that people will talk about, right? So if your cousin had some IQ testing done because they wanted to see if she was appropriate for the GATE program at school, she might say, my full scale IQ score was, 125. Okay, cool. What do we do with these scores? Well, all of the IQ scores that come from the WAIS and things like the Stanford Binet and other good, reliable, and valid IQ tests nowadays have their scores based on the normal curve. Okay, because again, we're using standardization in our administration of these tests. We are then able to compare your performance to the performance of your same age peers. So if your 12-year-old cousin, let's say, took the WISC today, that's the one that you would use for a 12-year-old, okay? Your 12-year-old cousin takes the WISC, we're going to compare her performance to a bunch of other 12-year-olds, okay, who are these same age peers. Well, when the Wechsler tests are put together, they're actually administered to thousands of people to get a good baseline comparison group, these same age peers. And what we did with those folks in administering the test, we do the same thing with you today. Okay, again, we begin with the same section, we begin with the same item, we give you the same amount of time, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So when we do this standardized administration and we compare your scores to your same age peers, 12-year-olds to 12-year-olds, 20-year-olds to 20-year-olds, 80-year-olds to 80-year-olds, what we can do on the backside is plot your score on the normal curve. Okay. If you look along the baseline here with me for a second, you'll see here on the x-axis that the Wechsler intelligence score range is listed here from 55 up to 145. What I want you to understand on the front end is the Wechsler tests have a mean of 100 and the standard deviation of 15. Okay, in the upper left side of the slide, I just typed that in for you. These tests have a mean of 100 and the standard deviation of 15. So here's the mean, right in the middle. Okay, it's 100. What do you notice about this distribution of scores? It's centered on 100. Okay, that's the middle of the distribution right here. Right, we drop a line down. This is the middle of the distribution. That's where the mean is. Okay. If you look at what's built into the slide, it says here 68% of people score within 15 points above or below 100. That's what the standard deviation is about. The standard deviation represents the average difference from the mean. And what this is saying is that about 2/3 of the population will fall between a score of 85 and 115. Okay? And almost everybody, about 95% of all people, will fall within 30 points of 100. Okay? almost everybody's going to fall between a score of 70 and 130. So if you ask me today to predict your IQ score, I'd say it's almost certainly between 70 and 130. And I'd be right 19 times out of 20. Okay? So that's basically the story, right? So if you score a 115 today, you might say, well, is that a good score? I'd say, well, it's certainly above average. And if I wanted to get fancy, I could say this. I could say a score of 115, I'm going to type in equals the 84th percentile. Now, you might be saying, what the heck does that mean? Well, I know that 50% of the population scores below 100 because this is a symmetrical normal curve, this bell-shaped curve. So half of the folks score below 100. So that's 50% of the population. There's another what? Well, there's another 34% who are scoring between 100 and 115. So I know that if you score at 115, you're at the 84th percentile. What does that mean? That means you scored at or above the scores of 84 out of 100 of your same age peers. Okay? There's maybe one person in 6 who would have a higher score than you do. Okay? Once you get out to 130, you're at a really high score, right? Almost no one. 2% of the population or thereabouts scores higher than you if you're at 130. You're really, really smart if you're out at 130, right? We don't have any doubt that you're a bright, intelligent person if you're scoring at that level. There's about a 1 in 50 chance that a random person would have a score higher than your score of 130. Okay? You don't need to memorize a million different numbers here, right? I want you to understand that the mean is 100, the standard deviation is 15, and that it tells us something about where your scores fall. Okay? And again, most scores fall between 85 and 115. That's about 2/3 of them. Almost all of them fall between 70 and 130. All right? Any questions about the normal curve there? You guys want to see some items? Let's take a look. So remember, I said we have verbal subscales and performance subscales. So we're going to look at each of these in turn. The verbal subscales are up here. Let me drop a line across here to separate them from the performance subscales down below and then off to the right. The verbal ones are done verbally. These are questions that I ask you directly. What day of the year is Independence Day? Similarities, it's another subsection here in the verbal subtest. In what way are wool and cotton alike? Arithmetic reasoning, this is the math section. We do it verbally. I don't give you a bunch of math problems. I do it verbally. If eggs cost 60 cents a dozen, what does one egg cost? On the arithmetic section, like some other sections, the more quickly you respond correctly, the more points you get. So if you say immediately 5 cents, you're going to get more points than someone who maybe takes 15 or 20 seconds to figure that one out. Vocabulary, what does this word mean? Comprehension, why do people buy fire insurance? Okay. Digit span, this is a memory section. I read you the number 7, 3, 4, 1, 8, 6, and I ask you to respond back to me. How many digits, by the way, should most people probably get on digit span? What would we expect them to get in terms of the capacity of short-term memory? Which we just talked about last Thursday. What was the magic number for short-term memory? I'm going to start crying if no one remembers. 5 to 9. Yep, 7 plus or minus 2. Down below, performance. Do something. In the picture completion subtest, we show you a picture like this, and the question is, what's missing? So, in this picture right here down below, what's missing? Tell me in the chat box. Yeah, the month is missing, right? An interesting follow-up question, that's not part of the standardized administration, might be, which month might it be? Or which month do you know it's not? Okay, well, because it's listing 30 days, I know, for example, it's not going to be February, okay, and so forth. Picture arrangement. The pictures below tell a story. Put them in the right order to tell the story. Okay, so I've got to go through and do this. Well, first, he's going to run outside. That's going to be number 1. Then he's going to start rolling the snowball into a bigger and bigger pile. And then he's going to get it standing up. And then number 4, he's going to put a corncob pipe and a button nose and 2 eyes made out of coal. Right? Block design. We want you to assemble these blocks. They're red on one side, white on the other side. They're half red and half white on two of the sides. Okay? Got to make a design that looks like that. Object assembly looks like building a puzzle. Digit symbol. Okay? You have to go through here working left to right, and you're going to have 2 minutes to fill in as many of the boxes up top as you can. Okay? Again, the rule is you have to work left to right. You can't skip through and do all the ones first. So that's a triangle. The 5 is a diamond. That's cool. The 4 is an X. Right? The 2 is a circle. Again, I'm going to compare you to same-age peers. So when your grandmother takes this, she's not being compared to young whippersnappers like you guys, 18, 19, 20 years old. She's being compared to other folks who are 70, 80, 90 years old. Okay, because obviously some of these subtests you're going to expect a deterioration in performance over time, right? Anything that involves speed or things like that, older folks are generally going to do worse on those subtests. Okay, but again, they're going to be compared to other older folks, so it's not going to make their scores drop precipitously because they're being compared to those same age peers when we compute their scores. All right? Questions about what we've got here on something like the Wechsler test? Doesn't this look like it would be kind of fun to do? Any questions or comments about what you see here? Think about reliability. Think about validity here, right? When we talk about validity, we say, how well does my measure what I say it measures? Does this look like it's a pretty broad assessment of your intellectual capacities? It's got some stuff about vocabulary. It's got some stuff about logical reasoning. It's got some stuff about sort of nonverbal reasoning, some visual spatial skills, some speed of processing. It's got memory. It admittedly doesn't have everything. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good test in terms of the validity, right? The breadth of coverage here. Compare this to what you might find if you Googled right now IQ test and try to take one online. I bet it would not be anywhere near as broadly based as this one is. Okay? All right. So what did we say we were going to do today? Let's go back to our title slide. We were going to talk about assessment. We did that. Talked about standardized procedures. So we talked about uniform testing procedures. We talked about standardization. That was important. We talked about IQ testing, the history of it, beginning with Binet all the way through the Wechsler test. We're going to use the normal curve to compare your performance to that of some same-age peers. Now we're going to get into the final segment on nature versus nurture. Okay? The nature versus nurture issue is big here. It becomes big again when we talk about language development next week. And then after spring break, when we talk about personality, we'll again revisit nature versus nurture. So what's the deal here? The big question I want to frame is at the top of this slide. Is intelligence determined by genes or environment? It's the nature versus nurture issue again. So remember, the nativists would say it's something innate, right? It's something driven by biology or genes. What would the nurture folks say? The empiricists would say, well, this is something that they would say is driven by environment. Okay, what your parents do, what kind of schools you go to, those are the things that shape your intelligence. Well, to have a discussion about intelligence and the degree to which it is genetically versus environmentally driven, we can start with a discussion of the difference between the genotype and the phenotype. So what is the genotype? Tell me in the chat box, somebody. When we talk about a person's genotype, what are we actually talking about directly there in terms of genotype? People who had bio or maybe even AP bio in high school should get this, right? It's their actual genetic makeup. Thanks for that, Megan, right? So it's whatever genes you have, right? Big B, little b, or two little b's, or whatever the case might be for something like eye color, right? What's the phenotype then? If the genotype is the genetic makeup, the phenotype is what? It's the physical characteristics. I would call them the observable, right? Observable, if I could just type, characteristics, right? And I would even put observable in quotation marks because when we're talking about IQ, we're not directly observing intelligence, but we're making it observable by using something like a good, reliable, and valid IQ test like the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the WAIST. right? So for phenotype, it might be your hair color or your eye color or your height or whatever the case might be, okay? Well, if we wanted to disentangle genes and environment in a discussion about their relative contributions to intelligence, we have two major approaches as researchers to try to disentangle genes and environment. We could opt to do what we refer to as twin studies, or we could opt to do what we refer to as adoption studies. And we're going to talk about these two different types of studies about 3 or 4 times here in the second half of the course. Okay. Well, with twin studies, we have at our disposal monozygotic MZ twins and dizygotic DZ twins. What the heck's the difference? What are monozygotic twins? What are they also often referred to as in layperson's terms? MZ twins are identical, which means they share what percentage of their genes? They share 100% of their genes. Dizygotic twins, we often refer to them as what? They're not identical twins, but instead they're what? They're fraternal twins. What percentage of their genes do they share? MZ twins share 100% of their genes. They're identical. DZ twins share 50% of their genes. In fact, DZ twins are no more similar to each other than are any other pair of siblings. Okay, so MZ twins and DZ twins. Okay, let's imagine this scenario. I give you 30 or 40 or 50 pairs of MZ twins, and I give you 30 or 40 or 50 pairs of DZ twins. And I give you free rein, okay, unencumbered by any ethical rules. You're allowed to do whatever you want with these MZ twins and DZ twin pairs to try to disentangle genes and environment. You want to figure out whether it's genes or environment that contribute to intelligence, or maybe it's both. Okay? You're allowed to do whatever you want with these sets of twins. What do you want to do with them? Does anybody have a mad scientist idea to separate out the genetic and the environmental contributions to intelligence? Come on, what would you want to do? Okay, let me be a little more specific. What would you want to do with the identical twins who share all of their genes? If you want to disentangle genes and environment, you got a bunch of people who are basically clones genetically of each other. How could you deal with them in such a way as to separate out gene versus environmental contributions to IQ? What would you want to do with them? Put them in the different environments. Megan has got it. And that actually happens, not because of mad scientists, but because sometimes MZ twin pairs get split up. Here's what I'll tell you. We call those MZ apart. MZ twins, identical twins who are reared apart. And I will tell you that the correlation coefficient for their IQ scores is positive 0.75. What's the highest that that correlation coefficient could be for those twin pairs? The biggest it could be is positive 1.0. Thanks, Kristen. Okay. So it's positive 0.75. That's a really big number. What do these people share? They share 100% of their genes, and because Megan put them in the different environments, they share none of the environment. That number right there is a proxy for the degree to which intelligence is genetically driven. Okay, if you want one number to discuss over spring break with your uncle when you're hanging out in your parents' backyard, and he asks about, what did you learn about genes as contributors to IQ, you'd say, I've learned that identical twins who are reared apart have a correlation coefficient for their IQ scores of positive 0.75. Genes really matter. Now, looking at that number, is it entirely driven by genes, this intelligence outcome? Is intelligence entirely genetically driven? When you see that that number is positive 0.75. It's not, because if it were entirely genetically driven, what would that correlation coefficient be for these identical twins, for these MZ twins, if this was entirely genetically driven? that number would be what? It will be positive 1.0. Thanks again, Megan. Okay? So, we know that there's wiggle room here. We know that there is a place for intelligence to be environmentally influenced as well. Let's look at adoption studies for a second, and let me give you a little piece that suggests that environment matters. Well, with adoption studies, here's the deal. What we do with adoption studies is we look at an individual child, and we compare that child in terms of their IQ score correlations with their bio mom and their adoptive mom. Okay? If intelligence was entirely genetically driven, think about this for a second. What would be the correlation here between the child and the child's adoptive mom? If it was entirely genetically driven, what kind of an association would we find between the child and their adoptive mom? It would be 0, right? Because they share nothing genetically. It turns out that this correlation coefficient isn't huge, but with a large enough sample size, it is statistically significant. It's a positive 0.16. So any number there greater than 0 is going to be indicating that what? That environment matters. Because what does the adoptive mom provide to the child? Does she provide anything in terms of genetics? No. She provides environment. They share an environment, that's all, right? Child and bio mom, that's where the genetic piece would come in. But when we get this correlation coefficient of positive 0.16, that's what indicates that something is going on here that is about environment. So let me just be explicit here. This is about environment, and this number up above, MZ apart of positive 0.75, what is that about? Identical twins reared apart. They correlate on IQ scores at positive 0.75. What does that say contributes? It's genes. Okay? So it looks like the take-home answer is going to be both genes and environment matter, right? The MZ twin apart number says genes matter. Child and adoptive mom says environment matters. Here's what I'm going to do. In our last 15 minutes, I'm going to give you 2 slides. One slide is going to be about evidence regarding that the fact that genes contribute to IQ. And then the second slide is going to be about evidence about environmental contributions to IQ. So let's look at each of these slides in turn. So this first slide is about data from twin studies, and it's evidence for a genetic contribution to IQ. Okay, this is the genes slide. Okay, let's look at 3 pieces of evidence together. The first one I've already given you, identical twins reared apart, the second bar here. We said that this is about positive 0.75. Okay, down the bottom here, let's label the degree to which these people share genetic inheritance. Identical twins share 100% of their genes. Identical twins reared apart also share 100% of their genes. Fraternal twins share 50% of their genes. Siblings, 50% of their genes. Until we get all the way over here, siblings reared apart, again, we're at 50%. Okay, these guys are unrelated individuals reared together at 0% of their genes. Okay, so the first piece of evidence that suggests a genetic contribution to intelligence is the fact that identical twins who are reared apart have a positive 0.75 correlation for their IQ score. So this is piece of evidence number 1. Okay, piece of evidence number 2 that genes matter. Let's compare these guys in bar number 1 with these guys in bar number 3. Look at those together with me for a second. The first bar is identical twins who are reared together. What's the third bar? Fraternal twins who are reared together. So in both cases, they're sharing the environment. What's the only difference between the folks in bar number 1 and the folks in bar number 3? What's the only difference between those 2 groups? Is it environment or is it genes? It's genes, right? These guys share all the genes. These guys share 50% of the genes. Look at the correlation coefficients here. We go from a correlation between identical twins reared together at positive 0.86 to a correlation for fraternal twins, DZ twins reared together, a positive 0.60. You don't need to memorize the numbers that I'm giving you up here. You got to think about and understand the logic. So here we're comparing 0.86 to 0.60, and we're saying, what's going on here? Well, this difference is due to what? This difference is due to genes. Because when you compare bar number 1 and bar number 3, what's the only difference? The only difference is the degree to which they are genetically related. They are 100% the same. They are 50% the same. In both cases, they're reared together. So it's not environment, right? Any difference here between 0.86 and 0.60 is not about environment. It's about genes. So this would be piece of evidence number 2 of a genetic contribution to IQ. Does everybody see the logic there? Let me stop for a second with that. 0.86 versus 0.60. MZ together versus DZ together. That helps you keep this straight. Let me just give that to you here on the slide, right? This is MZ together, and the third bar again is DZ together. Together means sharing the same environment. All right, the final piece of evidence for genetic contribution regarding IQ is the general pattern here. What's the general pattern with the bars in the bar graph here? As you move across the slide, what happens to the IQ score correlations that we're plotting here on the y-axis? What happens to those correlation coefficients? They get smaller as you move across the slide. What's happening in terms of genetic relatedness as we move across the slide? Well, we go from 100% the same, 100% the same, down to 50, 50, down to 0. Okay, so basically the big purple arrow moving left to right and pointing down as it goes across is that as you become less similar genetically, what? You become less similar in IQ scores. I meant to say less with 2 S's there. Okay, as you become less similar genetically, you become less similar in terms of IQ score correlations. Does that make sense? That's the overall pattern, right? So this purple bar, the purple arrow pointing across would be piece of evidence number 3, right? As you become less and less similar genetically, you become less and less similar in terms of IQ score correlations. Any questions on that at all? Again, I'm not going to ask you a test question that says which of these is the correlation coefficient for whatever, right? But I am going to give you something that makes you demonstrate that you understand the logic of what's going on here, okay? In fact, let me give you a quick polling question to make sure you've got this under control, and then we'll come back and talk about environmental factors. This is one of those ones I'll probably ask again as a clicker question on Tuesday, okay? Correlations between the IQ scores of identical twins reared together are higher than the correlations between IQ scores of identical twins reared apart. This finding suggests that what influences IQ scores? Is it genes, environment, gender, or bacon intake? So we're comparing and contrasting identical together with identical apart. So think about the logic. Again, nothing here about numbers. Think about the logic. I'll give you guys another 20 seconds or so to think your way through this one. All right, 5 more seconds. Awesome, let's see. All right, 3/4 of us are saying this is environment. That's correct, because we're comparing identical together versus identical apart. In both cases, it's 100% of the genes. So there's no difference between the two groups in terms of genetic relatedness. What's different? These guys are reared together, and these guys are reared apart. So that would help us figure out environmental contributions. What are the environmental contributions to intelligence? That's what this slide is going to be about. It's the final slide of the day. So 3 pieces of evidence that environmental contributions play a role in intelligence. Number 1, the number I gave you already. From the adoption studies, we know that the correlation coefficient of a child and the child's adoptive mom is positive 0.16. Okay? Again, tell me in the chat box. If environment did not matter at all, what would we expect that correlation coefficient to be? Because these guys share none of the genes, this would be 0. Okay, because it's greater than 0, it says environment matters. Okay, that's one piece of evidence that environment matters for intelligence. What's the second piece? The second piece is that the longer you spend in an impoverished environment, the more negative effect that has on your IQ over time. So it says here, an impoverished environment leads to a negative correlation between IQ and age. As your age goes up, thumbs up on my left hand, what happens to your IQ score over time when you're in that impoverished environment? Thumbs down. Negative correlation means your IQ score drifts downward as you get older living in this impoverished environment. What is an impoverished environment? It's where you've got bad schools, you've got not much going on at home that would facilitate your intellectual development. All you have is rocks and dirt and a stick. You don't have anything that would enrich you academically, intellectually. Okay, so the longer you're there in that poor environment, the worse it is for your IQ score. And then finally, we know that an enriched environment can increase your IQ score. There is something called the Flynn effect, and the Flynn effect refers to a gradual creep up of scores on IQ tests at a rate of about 3 IQ points every 10 years. So I'm going to type in here, population-wide, 3-point increase in IQ scores every 10 years or so. Okay, it was identified by a researcher named James Flynn. That's why it's called the Flynn effect. And it just refers to a gradual creep up in scores over time. Believe it or not, sometimes it's hard to believe, given what happens in our world today. People are gradually getting smarter over time, at least as we measure intelligence with our IQ test, like we've been talking about today. Okay, so this is, it's being argued here, evidence that an enriched environment is what's driving that creep up in IQ scores over time. How so? Well, first of all, that gradual creep up can't be genetically driven because genes and populations don't change that quickly. Okay. The argument is, from Flynn, that there are things that are more advantageous for intellectual capacity development today than was the case 20, 30, 50, 80, 100 years ago. So let's do a little mental exercise together. What was going on for you guys as you grew up that would be an advantage in terms of your intellectual development when you compare yourselves to your grandparents or maybe even your great-grandparents? What did you guys have, or what were you able to do that your grandmother or great-grandmother were not able to do? Tell me in the chat box. Give me some examples of things that were better for you when you talk about intellectual development. And I know the first answer is going to be technology. Let's move beyond technology. What else? Because I'm not sure that Google necessarily makes you any smarter. It gets you more information, that's for sure, but it doesn't necessarily make you smarter. How was your life different from that of your grandmother or your great-grandmother? In a way that would help you when we give you an IQ test. Denise has got something. Better education, okay? So Denise was able to have more years of school completed maybe than her grandmother. I'd be willing to bet that that's the case. Better nutrition, thanks Amy. That's fantastic. Yes, that matters. So access to education, access to nutrition. What about health care? Probably better now than before. Okay. Think about something as simple as the number of kids in the family. Okay. How many siblings did your grandparents or great-grandparents have? Tell me in the chat box if you're willing to do that. I can tell you my grandmother was like one of like 11 kids, right? We're seeing double digits, multiple people with double digits. Let me ask you this now, okay? There were 3 people willing to chime in. 34 divided by 3 was 11 was the average there for the grandparents. How about you yourself? How many kids are in your family? We're going to compare 11 to what? 4. 2, 5. If I'm doing the math right, that's 11. We're now at 4 versus 11 kids. Okay? How might that help you in terms of your intellectual development? What can your parents do with you when there are 4 of you that they probably can't do with you when there are 11 of you? Tell me in the chat box. Something that your parents could do that might have helped you with your intellectual development. More time with you. And what might they do during that time? They might read a book to you. They might sing a song to you. They might watch some interesting program on the History Channel with you. Or they might just talk to you or go for walks with you and have conversations with you. And all of that stuff might be part of this enriched environment that the Flynn effect is basically picking up on. Okay? So these are the 3 pieces of evidence that environment matters. On the previous slide here, we have the 3 pieces of evidence that genes matter. Identical apart, identical together versus fraternal together, and then this general pattern as you become less genetically similar and become less similar in terms of IQ scores. Okay? So, is intelligence determined by genes or environment? What's the take-home answer to that question? Is it determined by genes or environment? Thank you. Yes, it's both, right? Both things matter. Here's where we're going to go on Tuesday to wrap this up. We're going to talk about this model called the reaction range, which is a theoretical construct to help you think about the contributions of both genes and environment to IQ. So it's not one or the other, it's both. And what I love about this reaction range model is it basically says you have a range of scores that is dictated by what you inherit from your parents genetically. So you might be in a range from 80 to 100, or in a range from 110 to 130. And where you fall within that 20 or 30 point range is going to be environmentally driven. So the way I'm going to talk about this on Tuesday is that you inherit a genetic range of scores. You have a genetic anchor, if you will, along the IQ score range. And then your environment will either slide you up or down within that range. Okay? From that anchor point, you'll either drift up if you have an enriched environment, or you'll drift down if you have an impoverished environment. So it's a great model for thinking, again, about both genes and environment, because as we just learned, both of those contribute to IQ scores. Okay? Questions about that at all? Awesome, guys. Well, I appreciate your attendance and participation today. We are done with almost all of intelligence. What we're going to do is the reaction range. I'm going to do a couple clicker questions, and then we're going to turn the page and start talking about development. Remember, this is the sprint. The third quarter of the course is a sprint as we make our way through intelligence, development, emotion, stress, and health, and then finally personality. All right? So do the quiz, learning curve quiz for this intelligence section. Again, it's a segment here of Chapter 7. It's pages 312 to 326 that you're responsible for. All right? Everything I've got. So let's stop there. Have a great rest of your Thursday, St. Patrick's Day, and I'll see you guys back in AL 201 on Tuesday. Bye, everybody. Don't forget to X out so I can make it available to your classmates. Thanks. Bye.